The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chuy.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Nanaimo is looking at how to make people more aware of Doughnut economics, a framework council adopted back in 2020. An update on the topic was on the agenda at a Governance and Priorities Committee meeting Monday. Doughnut economics is a way of visualizing the economy that takes into account society's needs and our ecological capacity. It was first presented in 2012 by British economist Kate Raworth, who later wrote a 2017 bestseller on the concept. It envisions the economy as a donut. Think of the inside wall of the donut as society's needs, things like food, housing, income, health, and political voice. Think of the outside of the donut as our ecological ceiling, separated into 9 categories like air pollution, ocean acidification, and biodiversity loss. If the economy is functioning as it should, we are inside, in between both wheels of the donut. Everyone's needs are being met, but we aren't blasting past our ecological ceiling. Raworth contrasts that with what she describes as 20th century economic thinking, which she writes in the book has been fixated on growing GDP as the measure of progress. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, the amount of money spent on goods and services in a country in 1 year. Since adopting Doughnut economics back in 2020, Mayor Leonard Krogh says the impact hasn't necessarily been seen in terms of specific examples of projects, but has contributed to engaging the staff.
I don't think the changes have been significant in the sense that I can point to a number of programs and projects that are definitely Doughnut economics. But I think what is important is that it's engaged the staff of the city, and I think a number of leaders in the community, particularly the Prosperity Corporation, with the concept that is, to me, just common sense. This is not an ideological issue from my perspective. We all recognize we live on a planet that has limits. There's a limit as to the number of people we can sustain and provide a decent life to. There's a limit on the amount of oxygen. There's a limit on the amount of water, all of those things. And I just think Doughnut economics is basically saying, look, we want to create the kinds of communities where we can all be healthy and prosper and be happy, but within the ecological limits that are set by the finite nature of planet Earth.
Tuesday, I spoke with Colin Stansfield, CEO of the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation, which was launched this year. It's an economic development agency owned by the City of Nanaimo, Nanaimo First Nation, the Nanaimo Port Authority, Nanaimo Airport Commission, Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce, and Vancouver Island University. Stansfield says the Prosperity Corporation operates with Doughnut economics in mind.
It kind of gives communities and decision makers a practical way to shape a sustainable future, and that's then what becomes appealing for us, the Prosperity Corporation, is that you can use it as a decision-making framework. It can guide decision-making by helping us evaluate community policies and actions that meet people's essential needs while protecting the environment. And so if we were to take that then and apply it to classic economic development activities like investment attraction or industrial development, if we applied it to investment attraction, Doughnut economics would prioritize investments that create jobs, that support local needs, that respect environmental limits, that bring in businesses that contribute to long-term community well-being. If we're looking at industrial development, again, it's about then encouraging industries that provide good jobs and essential products while minimizing environmental impact, focusing on sustainable practices to support the economy and the planet. So if you could do that in investment attraction, you could do that in industrial development. You can also take it to, more and more often now, economic development agencies are being pulled into the space of housing, right? So Doughnut economics could also be used as a way to prioritize housing development in the context of scarce government resources. You'd be favoring projects that meet community housing needs affordably and inclusively. We're also ensuring sustainable land use, energy efficiency, minimal environmental impact, creating homes that support both people and the planet. And so it is a topic that has contemporary relevance that is easily approached by any number of folks through its visual appeal, and offers principles and decision-making frameworks that can be applied against conventional economic development.
So where exactly does the change in? You've got this framework, you're looking at it, you're looking at attracting maybe, for example, you mentioned there, unindustrial development to Nanaimo. What is different? Like, how do your decisions change based on the framework to ensure that it isn't just, almost like a form of greenwashing and saying we're doing this?
Sure. Yeah, I think the simplest answer is that it opens up a conversation. So beyond just asking people about how many jobs will you create, it's what are those jobs? What sort of training would they come with? What sort of benefits do you provide your employees? What kind of workforce are you looking to support? What kind of workplace are you looking to create? It allows you to talk to people about their supply chains and to think about procurement. Where are these goods coming from? Are you a business that's supporting circular economy? Are there byproducts from your manufacturing that can support a neighboring business? It allows us to have a conversation with businesses that we're hoping to attract to the area that is broader than just the single bottom line of conventional economic development.
At a meeting on Monday, one of the Nanaimo city councillors mentioned that sometimes they get negative feedback about this idea of donut economics from within the Chamber of Commerce. Has that been your experience at all?
I think whether it's within a Chamber of Commerce or a broader populace, there will always be some who have questions. But if I think about ways that small businesses can benefit from adopting the principles of donut economics, there's cost savings. When you focus on resource efficiency and waste reduction, businesses can usually find ways to then lower their operating costs. Customer loyalty, more and more consumers are choosing brands with sustainable and ethical values. Resilience, risk management, sustainable practices reduce dependency on finite resources. They help businesses stay resilient against supply chain disruptions that we've seen in recent years and regulatory changes that are related sometimes to environmental standards. Community support is big. Small businesses that focus on community well-being and fair wages usually build stronger local connections and can enjoy then that support from their community. And so, what else? Like employee satisfaction, retention. If you think about a sort of a competitive labor market, the commitment to fair wages, healthy working conditions, all of those can improve job satisfaction, retention, and even access to new markets and funding. Many investors, grantors, there are incentives now that favor businesses with sustainable practices. And so when small business can embed these principles of donut economics, they can thrive while actively contributing to a healthier and more sustainable economy. And so for folks who have questions about it or maybe haven't been shown ways to adopt those principles, that's where we're hopeful that our organization, the Prosperity Corporation, can assist them in recognizing the value of embracing donut economics.
And some of maybe possible ways to do that outlined in the book that maybe introduced donut economics to a broader public were things like, for example, having employees own a stake in the business, small or large business that they're working for. When it comes to the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation, what are some of the ways that you would work with or encourage or help businesses implement some practices that might be different from convention or tradition?
Yeah, so for us, it's really about then working in partnership with those other business associations, whether that is the Chamber of Commerce, a Downtown Business Improvement Association, Community Futures, other lenders. There are many programs that exist to capacity building for small and medium enterprises. So what we want to make sure is that we are then collecting all of those resources, helping people push them in the right direction, working in partnership with our friends and collaborators so that business owners, whenever they're ready, have access to the kind of support, coaching, teaching, the resources they need to explore concepts like you said of sort of shared employee ownership, which is a terrific topic these days when we think about succession planning for business. With so many businesses coming up for sale, what does it look like to transition that into employee ownership? And so there are as many, I think, opportunities for people to embrace those principles as there are businesses, and it's about finding that right match because, again, you are choosing now to shape and craft your business as a reflection of your values, and so let's find out what's most meaningful for you.
And I know we're still in the first year of the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation as a thing that's up and running, but have you heard maybe interest from outside the community of folks who hear that Nanaimo has adopted this donut economics model and are interested in that and maybe coming into the community because of it?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's one of the things that's probably hardest for some to recognize while we're here in this beautiful city on these gorgeous traditional lands of the Nanaimo Nation, that this is something that does set us apart on a world stage, that this outward expression and commitment to the values and principles of donut economics puts us up on a global level with cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Melbourne. And so folks, when they're looking to, oftentimes, think about just any country who wants to sort of open up in Canada, people who are drawn to the beautiful west coast of Canada and British Columbia, to be able to find out then that there's also a city that is embracing those same principles, those same values, is attractive. Because when you're looking to locate your business, everybody's going to come at you with the same offerings of, we offer a beautiful lifestyle, whether that's skiing in the interior or mountain biking on the west coast. We all share these similar opportunities. It's different when you're then able to align an economy and a community around those principles as well. And so this outward expression of our commitment to donut economics, then seeing it thoughtfully and meaningfully applied through our city plan and through the development of as we heard yesterday at the city committee meeting, a world-class measuring framework, monitoring framework. Substantially, we're not just then talking about this, that we're applying this. And so it is absolutely something that is attractive for businesses that are wanting to step into that 21st century economy.
Colin Stansfield is CEO of the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation, an economic development agency co-owned by a number of local stakeholders, including the City of Nanaimo, Nanaimo First Nation, and VIU.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
We're talking donut economics on today's program. At a Governance and Priorities Committee meeting Monday, Nanaimo City Council heard a report on the next steps for its donut economics framework, including an 18-month roadmap largely focused on building awareness around the concept. Doughnut economics is an idea from Oxford University economist Kate Raworth. It envisions the ideal economy meeting everyone's basic needs, the inside of the donut, while not exceeding society's ecological capacity, the outside of the donut. Maya Maki's recent publications are focused on donut economics. I got in touch with her to better understand what it could look like in a municipal context.
My name is Maya Maki. I'm the Associate Dean External and Outreach at the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria.
And what do you think donut economics should look like within a city context?
I think that when it comes to models, the best models are flexible. And so it needs to look like what makes sense for any given city. That's one of the strengths of the model. But it also can be a bit tedious or involved because you're trying to figure out, well, really, we've got this big pot, we've got all these possibilities. How do we narrow them down? And how do we pick what's really going to make an impact for us and what we can actually do? So it's both a strength and a weakness.
It was back in 2020 that the donut economic model was something that was being discussed for the first time around the Nanaimo City Council table. And here we are around 4 years later, and it still feels like the thrust of this presentation is, well, how do we define donut economics? How do we get city staff on board with the idea? How does this translate into something that people see concrete impacts in their day-to-day life from?
Yeah, and so you're talking about the what and the how, and I think that's what's challenging sometimes about donut economics. The what is it's this big sort of model with all these different elements. I mean, you've looked at it, climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution. Like there's a whole bunch of aspects, right, or elements to it. And one of the things I think that's really challenging for municipalities, especially if you're looking for best practices in other countries, is that different governments have different different responsibilities. And so you run into issues of, well, in Europe, this municipality has control over this thing that in here, in Nanaimo, that the BC government would have control over, right? So there does tend to be a bit of tension around the possibilities. There's all sorts of different possibilities in terms of the elements you can tackle, and then what can you actually impact, and can you really look to others, especially cross-border? That can be really challenging.
Are there any specific maybe programs or initiatives you're aware of anywhere in the world really that have taken this approach, taken this idea and ran with it and thrived?
Definitely, right, and that's one of the things that's really interesting. So, I'll give you a little tiny anecdotal one where in Paris, they're actually looking at development and working with developers, way early in the process to say, well, how could you do this better? And let's focus on maybe the sustainability of it, the use of materials, etc. But also, let's see if that can actually save you some money and still meet, the requirements. And so there are opportunities like that. That's a fairly recent one. They just went through the planning. I'll have to look it up here. It's a company called Rostad, I believe, or something in Paris that went through this process to look for those kinds of opportunities. Redmond, for a major French office building project. So that's the kind of thing that, especially if it's really early in some sort of a process, you can say, well, we'd like you to just spend a moment and think about this because there might be an opportunity that's a win-win. If I can dial it way back, one of the things that's really interesting is that if you look at something like total quality management, and I'm going way back here to like the 1970s, the gentleman Deming who created it was going around the United States going, we need to build in quality. And everyone was going, that costs money, go away. So he did go away. He went to Japan and there he was embraced. And what they found was that it actually saved the money. So it wasn't just producing better quality in Honda, in Toyota, and in other factories. It was actually reducing the cost of creating these vehicles. So there's this interesting paradox that happens when you just take a moment and say, well, what if we? And we do know from studies on creativity that if you constrain something, you tend to force creativity a little harder and you tend to come up with really innovative and interesting things if there are actual constraints. So I think that's one of the advantages of having early conversations, right? And then constraining something and then seeing if there's something there. And there's not always something there, right? The paradox, the Deming paradox doesn't always exist where you actually get better quality and lower costs. It's not as simple as that, but it does happen sometimes. And I'll give you another example too. Is it Grenoble? Yeah, Grenoble saved €1 million basically. So their city council focused on energy management, and they did some really interesting things. They were very siloed. They found when they sort of looked at what they could improve to really get a handle on donut economics and start implementing some interesting, innovative things. And so they created more cross-functional positions to try and get people to understand what was happening in different areas. And again, €1 million in energy management savings, just the energy management. And they're doing the most interesting things. They did a new school and community center merge. So instead of building two separate buildings, they're building a merged building. And that way they can always scale one up and scale one down as demographic shift. But there's also opportunities there, right, for people to interact in a different way. They're also moving away from swimming pools and trying to figure out how to use their lakes and rivers and really expand the ability for people to access and swim in lakes and rivers. So, it kind of depends on where you are and what you do, but it is just a matter of stepping back and thinking about it. We don't always have that time or those resources, but it's kind of interesting.
Now, if a city has adopted the donut economics model as its kind of vision for the community, are there things that suggests it should not do? Are there things that it needs to stop doing that would be kind of incongruous with saying, we've adopted donut economics?
I don't think the model's that prescriptive. So I appreciate that someone could be critical. Someone could say, well, you say you've adopted donut economics, but you aren't dealing with, oceans acidification or something like that. I think that municipalities have the advantage of saying, well, that's a federal responsibility, right? In that case. So they do have a little bit of an out there. The model gives them an out as well, though, to say, well, we can only, focus on so many things to start. And so we can't be expected to, I think it was Portland, I'm really curious to see what Portland's been doing with this because they were early adopters, right? Philadelphia, Amsterdam, Portland were the first ones to adopt, with the Nanaimo right in there too, very, very early. And Portland seems to have fallen off the map. Now, sometimes it evolves and they don't call it donut economics anymore. They call it something else, but maybe they've just abandoned it. And maybe they had too many initiatives on the books and they just couldn't sustain them. I don't know the answer to that, but it's kind of interesting.
Now, is a good shorthand way to think of the whole point of donut economics as maybe, as Kate Raworth puts it, in the 20th century, whenever we talked about economics, we were talking about GDP, the amount of money people in a country spend on doing anything, and the entire idea, the whole focus was we need to make that number go up all of the time, and if that is happening, things are good. And donut economics is saying, well, hold on, wait a minute, we need to make sure that everyone is taken care of and we aren't destroying the planet. And that should be the goal. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I guess what I'd say is that outer ring of the donut, right, is recognizing the limits of the planet, right, for that kind of growth. Are we growing in a way that recognizes that there are planetary limits? And then that addition of that inner circle is, well, okay, if GDP is rising, does it benefit everyone? Does it benefit most people in our community? Does it benefit all people in our community? And that was the idea of the inner ring, was to say that we need to make sure there's nobody in that middle, to push them into the donut where everyone is taken care of. So that is, I think, a fair representation.
Now, in the Canadian context, if municipalities start to buy into that, but the federal government and the provincial government maybe don't and are still in the sort of GDP must grow phase, like, what does it matter? What difference does it make?
Yeah, and so I guess what I would say is how I think of it is that monetary policy, right, is about the 2% growth per year, right? That's our goal. We want to grow, but we want to grow in a way that makes sense, and so that's monetary policy, right? And that has a huge impact on our cost of living through borrowing. So those are the pieces that connect for me. How we live is more complicated and there are more elements. So I think that there is room for others to adopt. And I think they kind of do, but may not call it donut economics, right? So and here we're talking about much bigger organizations. The nice thing about a municipality is that it's a much smaller organization, generally speaking, right? Unless we're talking about New York and some of these, huge cities, or Mexico City. So there's something manageable there about it. In federal government, we would probably see more silos. So they probably actually have initiatives that are happening that are essentially an element of donut economics, but you don't hear them all wrapped together, and tied together and coordinated and integrated. A municipality has the advantage of doing that because they're more manageable.
Another theme that sort of emerged from watching this meeting and some of the other conversations I've had is that this really still seems to be a bit of a theoretical, philosophical discussion at this point. How can this become something real enough for people in Nanaimo to engage with and care about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's first of all, reading Kate's book is great, but if you're not a reader, and we're not all readers, especially in these days of phones, she has a whole hub. If I've got it up here, yeah, doughnuteconomics.org. She's got a hub there, and they're nice, short videos. There are, things that people are doing and examples, and she calls it a lab, right? I shouldn't call it a hub because she calls it a lab. And what she's trying to do with her work is call people to action. So, dig around and see what's happening in other places. I mean, the Grenoble one I found absolutely fascinating. I thought that was a really interesting, some really interesting initiatives that they're doing there. And it made me think about sort of Victoria and Nanaimo as well, right? With swimming pools and things like that. So yeah, how can people learn about it? I guess I would say go to the hub, doughnuteconomics.org, start playing around, start poking around. And then also maybe, take a few of the cities that are doing this, because there are quite a few that are adopting donut economics in some form, and see what they're doing and think about, could that be done here? Is that even a municipal responsibility here? But if it is, what could we do? Could we swim in the lakes and the ocean and rivers and make that more accessible in Nanaimo? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's kind of a fun question to ask.
And the other thing that popped up at this meeting was a lot of talk about just the name and maybe the branding of donut economics. There were counselors who worried that maybe there were people who were upset at them and sort of wrote this off just hearing the name. There was a counselor who said that, this idea seems like common sense, but I don't think the name sticks with people. It seems kind of light and fluffy. I'll have to go double check on the exact wording. And for that reason, I have a hard time, getting people to buy into this when I try to explain. What do you think about that whole idea?
I think it helps that Kate Raworth, the author, is at Oxford, so there's a nice counterpoint to the donut. I mean, she's a legitimate, real scholar who's doing important work. At the same time, I appreciate what you're saying, right? Donut economics does not sound like something that you should take very seriously. So yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if it will evolve. Just as an example, in business we use balanced scorecard a lot, and that's become a big power sort of piece. Companies like TELUS use it broadly and exclusively, or had for a long period of time. But you can see now companies evolving beyond it, and I don't think they call it balanced scorecard anymore. Sick Children's in Ontario is a power user, and they basically don't talk about balanced scorecard anymore, although they use it, but they've got 5 quadrants. It's not a quadrant when there's 5, but you know what I mean? They've evolved beyond it. So perhaps in the future, donut economics will evolve to some other name, just rebranded, or will even evolve to maybe a municipal version, right? What have we found is useful from the model in municipalities, and maybe we create a whole different model that just pulls those pieces together, and we name it something that isn't as light and fluffy as a donut.
Is there anything else you think it's important that people in and around Nanaimo know about donut economics?
I guess I would just say it's all in the how, and with any good model, and I think donut economics is a good model. With any good model, it's all in the how. It can be useful, it can be practical, it can be helpful, it can have a huge impact. It's just in the what initiatives, right, will have the kind of impact that you want within your municipality. And so if I'm a citizen, I might have some fun poking around, looking at what other cities are doing, and then I might also, bring those forward. So it's all in the how. So talk to your representatives, your elected officials there, your councillors, your mayor, if you see some opportunities that maybe they're missing that would fall under the umbrella of that model.
Well, Maya Maki, thank you so much for being open to chat about it with me today.
That was fun. Anytime. Maya
Maki is with the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and R.B. Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.